Jeffro from Two Hacks Garage. Well, back on project, 311 cubic inch small block Chevy Ripper that's going to go in this nostalgia front engine dragster. However, in this video, we're not actually going to be building anything. We're not going to be doing any mock-up. We're going to be talking about clearances. 3 clearances when you're building your bottom end of your engine that you really need to check. These are important, whether it be a stock engine, a performance engine, or an all-out race engine. The 3 clearances we're going to be talking about, well, one of them is going to be the piston to deck height, one of them is going to be rod side clearance, and one of them is going to be crankshaft clearance to the actual block. Obviously, my build, that's not going to be important, but we're going to talk about it anyway. So let me show you what we're talking about, and we'll start explaining it. All right, so the first one what we're going to measure, I'm going to explain it first, is actually your piston to deck height. Now, your deck height is off the center of your crankshaft to the level of your deck here. Now, mind you, this one's been milled down. I can't remember how many thousandths it was taken down, but you go from the center of your crankshaft to the deck. We're not actually going to measure that, but what we need to know is, in correlation of that, how far the piston actually comes up to the deck height. We're not talking about the dome. That's going to be a separate conversation. I just need to know on this cylinder how far these pistons come up. All right, the second clearance I mentioned was rod side clearance. And rod side clearance is pretty simple. It's the distance between the sides of the rods. Remember, we talked about when installing this that there's different radiuses, and the large radius goes towards the counterweights of the crankshaft, and the smaller one goes to the center. Well, that distance right there is what we're going to need to measure. The third one I talked about, well, that's actually what you want to consider crankshaft or rod bolt clearance to the block. If you look here, your block is actually different shapes. These weren't all, in the foundries done exactly the same. So one thing you need to check, and like I said, this is not going to come into my build, but if you're building a stroker, you need to check the clearance of the furthest point here to the actual block. All right, so the tools that I'm going to be using for this, I'm going to be using just a set of calipers, feeler gauges, and a deck bridge with a dial indicator. Now, I'm going to go pretty in-depth with my engine, but what you're going to need to do is you're going to want to write all this down. Like I said, the reason why I like having all this information, kind of one of those mathy engine nerdy people. So I have here going to write down the deck height. I'm going to be writing down rod side clearance between 7 and 8, 5 and 6, 3 and 4, 1 and 2. Now, here's another important part. For most builds, you could go in the center of the piston and just write down 1. However, what I'm doing, and I'm going to explain this later, I'm going to take 4 points on the piston. Let me show you about that real quick. This is not the piston in the engine, but this is just for reference. I'm going to be measuring deck height here, 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 and here. The reason I'm doing that is, well, this is a high squeeze engine, and I really want to get my numbers accurate. But in most cases, if you're running a flat top piston or whatever, you can go off the center, here, or here. The reason I'm measuring both these spots, well, a piston actually rocks in there. However, I'm going to try to find absolute top dead center. But in my case, this is going to play into a lot of different things. And I'm going to measure here and just get my 4 points on there. The reason it's going to be important for me, well, here's a cylinder head right here. And if you look on this, this is how it would go in there, okay? Well, my thing, I'm running dome pistons and all that, and I'm going to be running a race engine. Well, I want to get my quench perfect. Well, what is quench? If you notice here, it says spark and Q. That's where the spark plug goes in, which is right there. So that area lines up right there. Q is quench, and if you look on your chamber, your quench pad is right there. And if you're wondering what quench is, well, quench is like the squish. So as this thing's coming up in the cylinder wanting to ignite, what's going on is there's fuel swirl. And that quench pad is meant to push that fuel swirl more towards the spark plug into this area to ignite it. That's important for clean combustion, getting all emissions and type of stuff like that. But sitting here, it's a race engine, I really want to make sure I'm burning all my fuel. So later on in this video, when we go to do this part, I'm going to explain a little bit more on my engine while my deck height is important for my quench. All right, the other thing you're going to need to know in this video, I'm not going to tell you what is ideal for your engine. I'm going what's ideal on my engine. Because if you're building a stock engine, well, you can use factory specs. I'm doing something high performance with an Eagle rod. If you look here, they actually have their specs for rod side clearance. Factory specs, I went and read on the Haynes manual, which is right here. They have a factory spec for a small block Chevy. And then I went a little bit step further because I like reading. I have Smokey Yunick's Chevy Engine Guide, read this book, and came up with what he said. Okay, now with that, like I said, this is going to be per your application. I'm just showing it how I'm doing it on mine. With that, I'm rambling. Let's go get to work. All right, so I'm going to start off with rods 1 and 2. And what I did is I put this crankshaft down. That's actually at the 6 o'clock position. Because remember, the engine's upside down. 12 would be pointing this way. This is 6. Normally, you can just measure in one spot, like a stock build, and call it good. However, I'm going to measure in 4 spots. So I have it at this. So I'm going to take a clearance here. I'm going to move the crank to 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock. And I'm going to write down all 4 of those numbers. So basically, you see how that moves back and forth. I'm going to start off with a feeler gauge here. And you want it to drag. Be careful on your crankshaft. You just want it to drag through there. And that one is not the right one. That was at 17 thousandths. So I'm going to go to 18 thousandths. Check that one. That doesn't feel too bad, but I'm going to try 19. Always try the next step up. That was 19. It's dragging a little bit more. You don't want to force it. You just want to feel that drag. Slight drag in between there. There we go. All right. So I'm going to write that number down. I'm going to turn the crank over to 9 o'clock. About right there. I'm going to do the same thing. Feels about the exact same. I'm going to try going up 1, see what it feels like. Little tight. I'm going to write that number down. On the 9 o'clock, I'm going to take it to 12. And this can be sometimes a little bit difficult to do. Might have to angle it. That feels the same on the 20th. Okay. I'm going to go 3 o'clock. There we go. I'm going to just check it at 21 thousandths. Too tight. So that right there, I checked it on 3 spots of the crankshaft. All came in at 20 thousandths. So, like I said, this is a high performance RPM engine. And I'm going to check every single one, like I said, in 4 spots. 12, 3, 6, and 9. And I'm going to go through everything and write all those down. If this was like a stock build, you could probably put it at 12 or 6, probably at 6, check it, and call it good. But as I said, on my high performance build, I want to check everything, get every little number, because I'm a engine nerd like that. And so, yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and check the rest of these. All right, so I got everything checked, and everything, guys, was like pretty much right at 20 thousandths. like I said, this is a brand new crankshaft. Everything's freshly machined. But yeah, between 7 and 8, everything is at 20 thousandths. 5 and 6, same thing. 3 and 4, same thing. 1 and 2, same thing. So what did Eagle say on this? Like I said, this is for your application and your build. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you by my application. Eagle said between 15 and 40 thousandths. I'm at 20,000, so I'm good by Eagle specs. Factory spec was between 10 and 23. That was off a Haynes manual. I'm good there. Smoky Eunuch, page 43. I marked that, but I don't know why. Between 15 and 20 thousandths. I'm right in the middle. So I'm going to call the expert Chevy guy. I'm good to go. I'm right in the middle at 20 thousandths. Why is rod side clearance important? That's the part we need to talk about. Okay, so if you don't have enough rod side clearance, what can happen, especially at high RPMs, things can get hot, things swell, and you can start getting friction in there, and you can close that gap enough where it's going to touch, cause a lot of heat, friction, and that is going to put metal, could potentially lock up the engine. That's no bueno. If you have too much rod side clearance, a lot of people say could be lack of oil pressure, lack of bearing oil, slinging out. That's a subject for another debate. There's people that say that works, people that say that's not the case. However, but what I do know, too much rod side clearance, well, your lateral movement on your rod, especially at high RPMs, because this is on a floater pin on your piston, these things can start moving and start touching and friction. So you have a little bit of oil between these two, and if it's just the right amount of clearance, it somewhat kind of holds it in place. Too much is bad because it will want to move more. Too little, guess what? You're going to friction and heat. That thing can happen also if you have too much. Move, start hitting. So what happens if you have too little rod side clearance? I actually had to do this on my big block Ford. What you have to do is you got to take your engine apart, and see right there, you have to machine the sides of the rods down, and it has to be done precision and perfectly. Now, I'm going to say this, if you needed to add an extra 6 thousandths clearance in here, you don't take 6 off here, 6 off here, you take 3 off here, and you take 3 off here. Now, mind you, you might want to call your machine shop to see if that throws off your balancing. I know in my Ford, at the case, it didn't. But that's what happens if you got too little rod side clearance. What happens if you have too much? Two things, guys. You can live with it, or guess what? You're going to have to get new rods. All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is rod to block clearance. A lot of people probably don't check that, and you know what? I learned my lesson the hard way. Rod to block clearance is the distance between the closest point. Most likely on almost everything, it's either going to be this part of the rod if it protrudes far, or mainly what it's going to be your rod bolts. And that clearance, and you also got to look for your crankshaft weights also, is that clearance, believe it or not, on your crankshaft weights, it's the clearance between here and your block. And you also got to look out for clearance between your rod bolts and your block. Okay, why is that important? On this build, it's actually not that important because this engine originally came with a larger stroke crank. I de-stroked it, so I know I'm going to be good. However, I'm going to check it. Where do you get in trouble? It's with stroker engines. When you have a larger crankshaft throw, it moves everything out, and you have a better chance of hitting something on your block. I've had that happen twice now with small block Chevy strokers, and what you end up having to do, you have to clearance the block to make sure that fits. Recommendation by Eagle, what they say is a minimum of 50 thousandths clearance between either your crankshaft weights, this distance between there and the bottom of that, and your rod bolts. So what you would end up doing is you're going to take, and I've used my calipers to get that measurement. And you got to be super careful. And you're best off, I'm not going to show you, but you're best off to look at every crank weight, and you're going to look at every rod bolt and go down the line. I'm just showing you right here because in my experience with small block Chevys, I've had this counterweight hit back here because that part is further in the block than anywhere else. So what you want to do, how you measure that, well, it's quite simple. I'm going to get that counterweight pretty much down in between there. To its closest point. And it's right there. So there's different ways you can do this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the back side of my caliper. I'm going to line it up to that edge. I'm going to run that in. There's more precise methods. 310 thousandths is what I'm at on that. Recommendation was just 50 thousandths. But what you also want to do is you want to look how close your rods are, your rod bolts are to this. But what you really want to be looking for in here is how close your rod bolts are to the inside of your bottom of your cylinder bores. And you're going to take a measurement of that. That case, you're probably going to need some feeler gauges stacked to get in there and go from there. So, like I said, I'm not really worried about that on my application, but if you're building a stroker or aftermarket rods with different bolts, you're going to want to make sure your crankshaft throws don't hit the block, and you want to make sure your bolts on the bottom of your cylinders in those areas, they don't hit anywhere. I've actually had to clearance both those scenarios. A lot of people overlook this, and you can get in trouble, especially at high RPM applications. Remember, with heat, things swell. Might be turning just fine when you're on an engine stand when it's cold like this. When you start throwing some RPMs and heat, it could be problems. Always check your crankshaft throws clearance and always check your rod bolt clearance. All right, time for the fun part. This is the part that I always like doing, guys. We're going to figure out your piston to deck height. What is piston to deck height? Well, it's the correlation of the center of your crank line to here, your deck, is your deck height. Now, in that cylinder, your piston is traveling up and down. What I want to know is how far, not the dome, but the actual piston itself, how far is that in relation to the deck height? Piston to deck height. In some cases, you're going to be down in the hole. In some cases, you're going to be flush or zero decked. In some cases, you're going to be out of the hole. That is all going to help you determine head gasket thickness and also your quench pad distance, which in correlation helps you determine your head gasket thickness. What I'm going to do, I said I was going to measure off 4 points. I'm actually going to measure on this off of 2 points, 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. I'm going to measure every single one of these. How am I doing that? Well, I have a Proform magnetic deck bridge with a dial indicator. This is actually quite simple. What you're going to do is you're going to put it on the deck and you're going to zero out your dial indicator. I'm going to move this so it's a little bit more where I want it to view it. I'm going to zero out my dial indicator. So right now, that's zero deck. The dial indicator is set at 0 on the deck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place it over in this area on the quench pad. And I'm going to find a nice flat spot. Now, mind you, this has got engraved numbers, so I want to stay out of that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to put it like right in the center of this area. So if you look here, this whole area is flat. I'm going to try to place that pretty much right in the center, pretty much about right there. And what I'm going to do then is you got to remember there is piston rock. You can place it on the outside if you want. There's rock. I'm going to try to, my goal is on the center of that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over, same direction as the engine would rotate. I'm going to bring this up and see where it's going to want to start stopping and coming back. You can go back with it a little bit. I do it a couple times for accuracy. Come back around. All right. So right now, that is telling me I'm pretty much about right at 15 thousandths in the hole. I'm going to check a couple other spots. Like if this was a mild build with flat top, street engine, you could probably get away with going in the center if it's flat, or on the outside edge and call it good. However, I'm building something somewhat high RPM. I know there's going to be some clearance issues. I know things are going to be tight, so I'm just doing my due diligence on this. I'm going to go to the outside of this. Come back up. All right, so right there, I'm going to use my reading on that spot right there, and that is reading right at 15 thousandths in the hole. So it was same in the other spot. So I'm going to go write that number down. So right now at my 12 o'clock position on cylinder number 2, I'm 15 thousandths in the hole. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the 6 o'clock position. And why is this important for my build? Is because if you notice right here, your quench pad's up here, so that's going to help me to determine my quench distance and head gasket thickness. I'm going to explain that in a minute. But in this area here, my spark plug sits there. And I already know, because if you see some black marker marks on things, I have some clearance issues. So I'm going to be playing with some Play-Doh, not in this video, but I want to know what this distance is. I'm one of those, hey, let's do a bunch of math. Let's figure some stuff out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zero this out again. Start running that down. I'm going to place this over in a spot in that distance where I want to obtain. So I'm going to go about right in the center of that spark plug location. I'm just going to do the exact same thing I just did. Bring it up. I bring it up, like that. Pump things up. Get going. Okay, it came down. All right, so that spot right there, about 13 thousandths in the hole. A little bit of variation, but you gotta remember there's piston rock. So on that right there, I'm gonna write that down. 13 thousandths on the low side on number 2, and on the top side was 15 thousandths. All right, so that's how you do that. But now let's explain why this is important. So you're probably wondering why this is important. Well, it's pretty simple. It's commonly overlooked, but a lot of things what we need to calculate is your quench. Like I said earlier, your quench is when your fuel's in the cylinder tumbling and swirling as it's coming up between the bottom of that cylinder head, like I showed you in this area. As this starts to squish, theory is it pushes it back over in this area to be ignited off your spark plug. You don't want too much quench. 60 thousandths is like the max. Okay, any more than 60 thousandths, always refer to your build, but you start running issues where you're not properly combusting that fuel. It's going to have carbon buildup, more emissions. I want a nice, clean burn. Yes, you can compensate with different range heat spark plugs, but I'm trying to get this as close as possible. So let's take a look at something real quick. All right, so like I said, your quench. So if we were looking at this piston, I got spark plug here, quench pad here. Let's go look at the other one as a reference. Same thing, spark plug here. This is for my 292 build, but in theory, it's the same thing. Spark plug, quench. Spark plug, quench. So this flat spot right here is actually going to be the distance. The quench is going to be the distance between on your cylinder head, and like I said, this isn't the cylinder head I'm going to use most likely. I mean, this is my 292. This is just for demonstrative purposes only. So it's the distance between this and here. Like I already explained, you don't want too much quench. Then you run into fuel burning problems, emissions, carbon buildup, and it's just not a good burn. You want to get it exactly where you need it, as close as possible without touching. Asterisk. Why is there an asterisk? Well, okay, I've been doing some research for my build. You're going to have to do some research on your build. There's a lot of information out there, but I'm using steel rods, okay? And I'm going to be running high performance application over 6,000. So with that, you want a quench of nothing under 38 thousandths and your ideal top end is 43 thousandths. So my target quench is going to be 40 thousandths. Why do I say per application? Well, here's why. If you're running an aluminum rod, that's going to stretch more, and you're going to need to have a different distance. These are some general guidelines from what I've read. Under 6,000 RPM, milder build, you can actually have a tighter gap. Because you got to remember, when things are hot, they expand, and when they're moving fast, well, there's more of a chance of hitting. You don't want to hit anything. So from everything I've been reading and researching, phone calls, under 6,000, you can go down as tight as like 32 thousandths. But since I'm going to be really buzzing this thing up, steel rods, my target goal is 38 to 43 thousandths. I'm going for a target of 40 thousandths on that. Okay, where does that come into important when you're talking about head gaskets? Here's why. Okay, we know between that piston is, on the quench side, it's 15 thousandths in the hole. Okay, so if I was to lay this cylinder head flat on the deck, between this and the quench is 15 thousandths. That's too tight. That's where your head gasket comes in. This is going to help you determine your head gasket thickness based upon your target quench. So think about it like this, guys. You're going to take your quench and your head gasket thickness to determine, or your quench in the hole to determine your head gasket thickness with your target quench goal. So my target goal is 40 thousandths quench. I'm 50 thousandths in the hole. So think about it this way. 40 thousandths head gasket, 15 thousandths in the hole is 55 thousandths. Too much. So in my case, since I'm in the hole, I'm going to subtract this number from the head gasket thickness that I want, or my target quench thickness that I want. So 40 thousandths target quench minus 15 thousandths is 25 thousandths. So I can look for a 25 thousandths compressed thickness head gasket that would get me in the range of my target of 40 thousandths quench. See where I'm going with that? It's kind of that race engine nerdy math type stuff I'm always talking about. Okay, now hang on here just for a second. Not always are you going to find that exact thickness. You want to get it as close as possible. I know they make 27 thousandths compressed thickness gaskets for my application. So 27 thousandths plus the 15 thousandths is 42 thousandths, which still puts me in here. You want that target range. I err in the middle. If you need to err on the side of caution, go on the high side. Now let's talk zero deck. If this was zero deck and you wanted 40 thousandths, you would want to look for a compressed thickness gasket of 40 thousandths. Okay, let's talk about this for a second. Let's say you're out of the hole. So now you're negative. Even when you're out of the hole, that's a negative. If your target quench is 40 thousandths and you're 15 thousandths out of the hole, you're going to add those two numbers. So you're going to want to go with a 55 thousandths quench, or 55 thousandths compressed thickness gasket, because you got 55 thousandths of an inch compressed. You're 15 out of the hole, so you take that out. Now you're at your 40. See what I'm saying? It's all math. It's all that stuff that we should have paid attention to, and most of us didn't, but now we have to relearn it. Get it? Nerdy stuff, quench, head gasket, deck height, all that fun jazz. Anyway, I need to get measuring the rest of those. All right, so there we have it. I got my measurements all in place on everything I showed you. Three, I'm going to say, commonly overlooked clearances that you really need to check and why it matters. In some stock builds, maybe you can get away with it, maybe not. But I like to check everything out, compare it to a factory spec, compare it to a high performance spec, compare it to the manufacturer's of the product spec, and, you know, really go from there. I do a lot of research on this. I really like the nerdy race engine math type fun stuff. But yeah, so I explained to you the rod side clearance, why that matters, why it's important. I explained the crank and rod bolt clearance to the block, why that's important. Like I said, on my engine, it's not so important because I de-stroked it. But if you stroke an engine, you can come into some problems there. And I have, and it adds a whole lot of time to an engine build. So in some cases, it's good to always mock something up when you get started on a stroker engine before you get it all assembled and realize, well, you got a problem. Last one was the piston and deck height. I explained how to do that. I went a little bit more in depth because the build that I'm doing with it. And I now know what compressed gasket thickness I need for the target quench that I'm going for on this engine. However, I'm not going to order them yet. Reason being, it'll be a subject of another video here down the road a little bit. I don't know my piston to valve clearance yet. If you notice that I'm running a domed piston, I'm going to have to play with some Play-Doh, which I have sitting over there, and, you know, see how close that is. So once I know that piston to valve clearance, I'll be in that ballpark and finally able to order a head gasket. See how this all kind of adds up, all this math, all this checking, this, that, and the other. You know, if you're building a flat top engine with a mild cam, you're probably going to be perfectly fine when you're measuring everything out and you piston to valve clearance, all that fun jazz. However, when you run a domed piston or you have like a radical high lift cam with a lot of duration, you need to really start getting into the intricacies of this and checking every little thing. The video was a lot longer than I wanted to, but I really wanted to just kind of go in depth on 3 clearances you guys should really know, really check for, and why it matters, especially to the application you're doing. That said a lot right there. So am I going to order head gaskets? No, I'm in the ballpark of knowing what I need. I just need to know my piston to valve clearance. But before I do that, I got to get a cam stabbed in there and get my cylinder heads, which I still don't have yet. So it might be a little bit before that, but probably the next few videos, what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to get a camshaft in there, get timing gear, change set, all that on there, probably get the bottom end with my oil pump and all that jazz installed. So expect more content on that. I'm still waiting on bearings for my 292, so we can get going on that. But until next time, 2 Hacks Garage. Hope you enjoyed this video. Have a good one.